All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of you are probably familiar with, at least on the surface, but we're going to be going much deeper than I think most people go. We're talking about stereotype threat.
Yeah.
So, like, just at its most basic level,
hmm
stereotype threat is this worry that can kind of creep into your mind when you're in a situation where you're being evaluated and you're afraid that you might accidentally confirm a negative stereotype about a group that you belong to.
Right.
And you can see how this could have a huge impact on, say, students from marginalized groups
Mm.
when they're taking those really important tests, right?
Mm.
That added pressure can really mess with their performance.
Absolutely.
And while that performance hit is something that's pretty widely known and talked about, what we're really going to dig into today is how stereotype threat goes way beyond just those test scores.
Yeah.
It can really fundamentally change your underlying motivation, even in those situations where you might actually be performing just fine.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating about it,
That's
right?
exactly.
It's not just about whether you succeed or fail on that one particular test. It's about how it changes how you approach achievement, how you think about it,
Yeah.
and really kind of your whole motivational system over time.
Yeah.
And to guide our deep dive today, we're using this framework called the Motivational Experience Model of Stereotype Threat.
Yeah, and I love this model.
Yeah.
It's so much more comprehensive than just like, did somebody pass the exam, right?
Yeah, right.
This really looks at how stereotype threat impacts, like you said, your whole approach to achievement, your sense of belonging, even that intrinsic motivation, like your inner drive to do things over time.
Over time.
So we're really trying to paint this complete picture for everybody listening.
Absolutely. And this whole line of research actually started, was a pretty straightforward question, right? It was, how much do these social and psychological pressures that we're talking about actually contribute to the academic differences that we see sometimes between different minority groups? It's about looking beyond just someone's innate abilities and saying, well, how much is this social environment actually playing a role?
Yeah.
And the research has shown that it plays a pretty significant role.
And I think one of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading through all this was that even really, really talented students who are facing these negative stereotypes,
Right.
they're much more likely to actually avoid the fields where those stereotypes exist, even if they're doing really well in those subjects.
Yeah.
And there's this great quote in the paper. It says, while you can do it, you shouldn't.
Oh, wow.
And like, think about that, right?
That's not about ability anymore.
That's not about ability.
It's about fit, right? It's
Yeah.
about whether you're allowed to be there or whether you should be there.
Or whether you deserve to be there, maybe.
It speaks volumes, yeah. I mean, it really highlights how stereotype threat can really shape a student's, long-term academic trajectory and
Yeah.
even their career paths.
Totally.
So what we're going to try to do today is really, really understand these motivational processes that students who experience stereotype threat,
Right?
how are they experiencing those? How does that shape their journey? And we really want to go beyond just looking at those test results and say, okay, how is it affecting how much they want to do something and really their inner drive.
Right. And we're going to be looking at this through the lens of how we all manage our own motivation.
Right.
Right. So the self-regulation of motivation
Right.
is
Yeah.
kind of the big framework we're using here.
Absolutely.
So to really unpack this, we're going to look at a few really key motivational variables
Mm-hmm.
that stereotype threat can really kind of mess with.
Right.
And these are things like, do students avoid achievement or embrace it? Their sense of belonging in that academic setting, how interested they are in the subject itself, like the subject matter, and how much they identify with that particular domain or field of study, and then ultimately their career motivations and intentions.
Right.
So let's dive into that first one. How does stereotype threat actually change how students approach achievement?
So one of the things that's really interesting here is that when we talk about someone being, oriented towards achievement, it's not just about how motivated they are, it's actually the type of motivation that they experience. So researchers talk about things like performance avoidance goals, which are really fueled by this fear of underperforming.
Right, like not wanting to mess up.
Versus approach goals,
Okay.
which are really about working towards success, right?
Right.
You can see how those two mindsets could lead to very different outcomes.
Yeah, it sounds like they could have some pretty dramatically different effects.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the research pretty consistently shows that those performance avoidance goals, they're associated with all these negative outcomes. They're linked to lower self-efficacy, so you don't believe in yourself as much. You have more test anxiety. You might engage in more surface processing of the material. You might not go as deep.
Right, like not really engaging with it.
Exactly. And of course, that can lead to poorer overall performance, and it can even lower your intrinsic motivation, right? Like that inner spark
Yeah.
that really drives you, that can even be lower when you're just focused on avoiding failure.
So where does stereotype threat fit into all of this?
Well, one of the earliest studies looking at this was done by Brown and Josephs back in 1999.
Wow, that's a while ago.
It is, yeah. But it's a classic. And
Okay.
basically what they did was they gave students a math test, and they told some of the students that this test was going to show whether they were exceptionally weak in math, right? That's that subtle little trigger for avoidance.
Oh, I see, I see.
Or they told other students that this math test would show if they were exceptionally strong in math.
They're kind of priming them for one or the other.
Exactly. And what they found was that the women who, we know are often subject to that stereotype that they're not as good at math,
Right.
they actually performed worse when they were given that little hint about potentially being exceptionally weak,
Wow.
compared to the women who were given the hint about potentially being exceptionally strong.
So that's like a really direct line, right? Like you have the stereotype,
Right.
then you have this prime that's kind of activating it, and then you actually see the performance hit.
It's a beautiful demonstration of how powerful just that subtle shift in mindset can be.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And building on that, Smith, in 2004, suggested that a lot of what we see happening under stereotype threat might actually be because people are adopting these different achievement goals,
Right.
like we were talking about, that avoidance versus approach.
Right.
And her later research in 2006 actually directly supported this idea.
Okay.
She found that when women were reminded of that negative stereotype about women in math,
Okay.
so that's the stereotype threat being activated, they reported being more likely to focus on avoiding mistakes in an upcoming math exam compared to women who weren't given that reminder.
So it's like they're more focused on not messing up
Exactly.
than they are on actually succeeding.
Exactly. So you can see how that could be detrimental to, actually engaging with the material and doing your best.
Totally. Yeah.
Now, this whole idea of wanting to avoid negative outcomes can show up in slightly different ways, but they're all kind of related.
Okay.
So there's this concept of prevention focus, which comes from regulatory focus theory.
Okay.
And it's kind of similar to that performance avoidance idea, but it's a little bit broader.
Okay.
So people with a prevention focus, they're really driven by this desire to avoid losses, to avoid those negative outcomes. It's about being safe and secure.
Right. Kind of playing it safe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, how does this relate to stereotype threat?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Well, when you're in that prevention-focused mindset, it tends to activate this whole cascade of security-related processing, right?
Okay.
So think about it. You're more averse to making mistakes, you're less creative, you prefer stability and things that are familiar. You might even be more concerned with maintaining social harmony and not rocking the boat.
Right.
Right.
Now think about a lot of the tasks that are used in stereotype threat research. They often have this structure where you're penalized for incorrect answers, and success means avoiding those penalties.
Right. Right.
So in a way, that structure itself can almost naturally activate that prevention focus, especially when someone is also feeling that pressure of a stereotype.
So it's not just the stereotype,
Right.
but it's the context of the evaluation itself
Exactly.
that's playing a role here.
Yeah, the structure of the task really matters.
That's so interesting.
And research has shown that when people are under stereotype threat, they actually do tend to pay more attention to those cues that signal potential losses or pitfalls.
Right. Yeah.
A good example of this is a study by Keller in 2007.
Okay.
He had men who were led to believe that gender differences had emerged on a verbal task.
Okay. So that's the stereotype threat.
Exactly. That's activating that stereotype threat. And these men, some of them were also put into that prevention-focused mindset,
Okay.
where they were really focused on avoiding losses. And these men actually performed worse on a verbal ability test compared to men who were in more of a promotion focus, where the emphasis was on, solving as many problems as possible.
So it's almost like the threat makes that avoidance focus even more detrimental
Exactly.
to performance.
Yeah.
And there's another study, too, that I thought was really interesting by Keller and Bless in 2008 that actually took this idea into a more real-world setting with a driving test.
Oh, wow.
So they had women, and some of the women were told that men typically perform better on this driving exam.
Oh, okay.
And you can imagine how that would trigger that stereotype threat for a woman who's about to take a driving test.
Oh.
And then other women were told that, women tend to do better.
Right.
And what they found was that those women who were told that men typically do better and who were also leading towards that prevention focus
Right.
actually ended up performing worse on the test.
Wow. So the expectation really does shape the outcome.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
It is, yeah.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. And this is kind of counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of people. There's this concept called regulatory fit. And it basically means that if the task you're doing kind of matches up with your current motivational focus, whether it's about trying to achieve gains or prevent losses,
Oh.
you tend to do better, right?
Mhm.
So given that stereotype threat often kind of nudges people into that prevention focus,
Right.
you might think that performance would actually be better under stereotype threat if the task is framed in terms of avoiding losses.
Oh, interesting.
And there actually is some evidence for this.
Oh.
So Grimm and colleagues in 2009 found that, at least in the short term, if the task was set up in a way where you lost points for wrong answers instead of gaining points for correct ones,
Right.
performance under stereotype threat could actually improve a bit.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, isn't that counterintuitive?
Yeah, you would think any kind of pressure would just automatically make you do worse, but I guess
Yeah, right.
there's something about that alignment between your mindset and how the task is structured that can actually be beneficial.
Yeah, so there might be some ways to leverage that.
Right.
But there's a catch, right?
Of course there's a catch. There's always a catch.
There's always a catch.
So Stahl and colleagues in 2012 found that while this prevention focus under stereotype threat, it might initially increase your focus and your cognitive control, almost like a fight or flight response.
Right.
It actually leads to this cognitive fatigue over time, and it can actually result in worse performance in the long run. So it's like you get that initial boost, but then it's followed by a draining of your resources.
Yeah, like you're kind of burning the candle at both ends.
Exactly.
And you can only sustain that for so long.
So really the big picture here is that stereotype threat is pushing people towards trying to avoid those undesirable outcomes, right?
Right.
Whether it's through those performance avoidance goals or whether it's through that more general prevention-focused mindset.
Right.
And this has all these downstream effects, not just on performance, but also on things like interest, cognitive resources, even physiological responses.
Yeah, it's affecting them on so many levels.
Exactly. And this is a really crucial point in the motivational experience model, right?
Yeah.
It's saying that these initial orientations towards achievement
Right.
are really setting the stage for how someone is going to experience that task motivationally.
Right.
Particularly, their sense of belonging and how interesting they find that activity.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into that sense of belonging then. How does stereotype threat affect that? That need that I think we all have to feel like we fit in, like we're connected to others.
This is so crucial, right?
Mhm.
Belonging, this feeling of social connection and acceptance, it's a fundamental human need.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely essential for academic success, especially for students from those underrepresented minority groups that are constantly facing these stereotypes about their abilities.
Right.
Hurtado and Carter, they pointed this out way back in 1997, that feeling like you belong, it's a really strong predictor of achievement, how motivated you are, how interested you are in the material, whether
Yeah.
you stick with it, how engaged you are overall. So it's not just a nice to have, it's really, really fundamental.
Especially when you're navigating those stereotypes.
Exactly.
So if you don't feel like you fit in, it's hard to imagine that you would really be able to thrive
Right.
in that environment.
And researchers like Cohen and Garcia, Mendoza Denton and colleagues, Walton and Carr, they've all shown that belonging is actually one of those really key processes that explains why stereotype threat can lead to lower achievement for stigmatized students.
Okay.
And Walton and Cohen in 2007, they came up with this really interesting idea of belonging uncertainty,
Okay.
which is that feeling of not being sure about how strong your social connections are or how secure they are.
Right.
And their argument is that people who are targets of stigma become much more sensitive to even little tiny cues that might suggest that they don't belong.
Yeah, like they're hyper aware of those things.
Exactly, yeah. They're on high alert.
Right.
And one of their studies in computer science really nicely illustrates this. They
Yeah.
had African-American students, and they were given subtle cues that suggested they might not have as many friends
Oh, wow.
in computer science compared to other students. And these students actually reported feeling less like they belonged and were less optimistic about their chances of success in that field compared to those who either got like positive belonging cues or no cues at all.
So even those subtle hints about social connection
Yeah.
can have a big impact.
They can. They can. And, it's not just about experimental manipulations, right?
Right.
Survey data from Cherian and Plout in 2010 also kind of echoed this.
Okay.
They found that across different social groups and academic areas, when people had lower interest in a field, one where they might face a stereotype,
Right.
it could often be traced back to these reduced feelings of belonging, like they didn't feel like they were similar to others in that field.
Right. Like they don't see themselves reflected in the people
Exactly.
who are already there.
I don't see myself here. I don't see my tribe here.
And even just the perceived numbers can matter, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So Murphy and colleagues in 2007 show that when women watched a conference video,
Mm.
that was for, math, science, and engineering majors,
Okay.
and this video had a much higher proportion of men than women. So subtly reinforcing that stereotype,
Right.
the women, but not the men, reported feeling less like they belonged in those fields.
Wow. So even just the visual environment can send these powerful messages
Right.
about who is and who isn't expected to be there.
And it's not just the visual environment, though.
Right.
The language we use can also have this effect.
Absolutely.
So Goucher and colleagues in 2011 found that job descriptions that used more masculine-sounding words, emphasizing things like competition and dominance,
Right.
actually led women to feel like they would belong less in those jobs,
Oh, interesting.
and they had reduced interest in them.
So even the language itself can create these barriers.
Yeah, it can almost create like a less welcoming atmosphere.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not just the words, right? Even the pronouns
Oh, wow.
that are used can have this effect. So Stout and Disgupta in 2011, they did a study where they manipulated whether a job description used male or female pronouns.
Okay.
And they found that when it used male pronouns, it actually led to a decrease in feelings of belonging for women who were applying for that job.
Wow, yeah.
So really, just those subtle cues in the language can have a pretty big impact.
And it goes beyond language, too,
Oh, yeah.
right? So Cherian and her team, they've done some really fascinating work on the physical environment, too.
Okay.
So in one study in 2009, they found that women who were in a computer science classroom,
Okay.
and this classroom was decorated with all these like stereotypically masculine objects, things like Rubik's Cubes and Star Trek posters,
Right, right.
those women reported a lower sense of belonging in computer science
Oh,
than women who were in a classroom that had, just more kind of neutral things like nature posters.
yeah. So even the things you see around you
Right.
can communicate these stereotypes.
And what's really interesting is they didn't find this effect for men.
Oh, interesting.
So it was specific to the women who were in those classrooms.
And they actually replicated this finding in a virtual classroom study in 2011.
Oh, wow. So even online.
Right. So it's not just about the physical space.
Right.
Even when, the actual course material, the professor's gender, the number of classmates, all of that was held constant.
Right.
They still found that women reported lower belonging in a virtual classroom that was designed to, kind of represent those masculine computer science stereotypes.
So it's really pervasive.
It is. Yeah.
But there's some good news, right? There are things that can be done to try to boost that sense of belonging.
Absolutely. And research has actually shown that interventions that are aimed at boosting belonging can be really, really effective in counteracting stereotype threat.
Okay.
So a great example of this is Walton and Cohen's 2011 study. What they did was they actually framed those social challenges that we talked about,
Right.
including belonging uncertainty,
Okay.
as just like a normal and temporary part of the transition to college. Yeah. Right. Like everyone's feeling a little bit uncertain and everyone's trying to find their people.
Right.
And by giving this alternative explanation for those negative feelings that wasn't based on their group identity, they saw a huge increase in the sense of belonging among African American students.
That's great.
Yeah.
And this actually led to improvements in their engagement, their persistence in school, and even their grades years later.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So really powerful long-term effects.
It really highlights how powerful that sense of belonging is
Yeah, it really does.
and how crucial it is to address that if we want to support students who are facing stereotype threat.
Okay, so we've talked about how stereotype threat influences that kind of initial approach to achievement, right? Whether you're focused on avoidance or approaching success.
Right.
We've talked about sense of belonging.
Yeah.
What about that actual experience of engaging with the learning material itself? How does stereotype threat affect what's called situational interest?
So situational interest is really that feeling of being engaged and involved with the learning material right there in the moment. It's
Right.
that spark of curiosity, that feeling of being really captivated by the material.
Right.
And it's important to distinguish it from just enjoyment, right?
Okay.
Enjoyment can come from familiarity, it can come from achieving a goal,
Right.
but interest really pulls you into those new and complex ideas. It focuses your attention, it can even replenish your cognitive resources.
Oh, interesting.
It's kind of like it's very akin to intrinsic motivation.
Right.
And at its peak, it can even lead to that feeling of flow,
Oh,
where you're
yeah.
completely absorbed in what you're doing.
So it's more than just liking something.
Right.
It's about being genuinely intrigued by it.
Exactly.
And situational interest is a really good predictor of whether someone's going to stick with something
Yeah,
and even identify with those educational career paths down the line.
exactly.
So understanding how stereotype threat impacts that is really important.
Absolutely. And we do have some research that speaks to this. So Smith and colleagues in 2007, they looked at how stereotype threat affected women's interest in a computer science programming task.
Okay.
And before they started working on this task, some of the women were told that men are generally better than women in, math-related areas.
Okay, so that's the stereotype
Right,
threat
yes.
condition.
While other women were told there was no gender difference.
Okay.
And what they found was that the women in that stereotype threat condition, they actually reported feeling less absorbed in the task.
Okay.
And they rated it as less interesting compared to those in the no threat condition.
So the threat isn't just making them anxious about how they're going to perform,
Right.
but it's also actually making the task itself less appealing to them.
Exactly, yeah. And this was particularly noticeable when they also adopted those performance avoidance goals that we talked about earlier.
Right, right.
So it's kind of this double whammy.
Right.
You're worried about failing, and the task itself is also less interesting to you.
And there was another study, too, that I thought was really interesting by Toman and Sansone in 2012. And they actually looked at how feedback that seemed to be biased against women
Okay.
could affect their interest in a science task.
Okay.
Now, it wasn't a classic stereotype threat manipulation,
Okay.
but the idea was that if you get this negative feedback
Right.
and you suspect that it's due to a bias against your group,
Right.
that's likely going to trigger that same feeling of threat.
Absolutely.
And what they found was that the women who received this feedback that seemed to be biased towards men actually rated the science task as less interesting.
Wow.
And this lower interest that they felt actually predicted whether or not they would look for more information about related careers in the future.
Oh, so it actually had this kind of downstream effect.
Yeah, so the immediate lack of interest
Yeah,
can actually have those longer-term consequences.
absolutely.
Now, one thing I want to point out here is that some other studies have looked at how stereotype threat affects interest, but they've often measured it in terms of whether participants would pursue a field in the future.
Right.
And while that's definitely related,
Right.
situational interest, what we're talking about here is really that immediate,
Yeah.
in-the-moment experience with the task.
That gut feeling
Yeah.
of, am I drawn in?
Right, right.
Am I engaged?
And then that immediate interest, that's often that stepping stone, right?
Right.
To developing that more lasting individual interest.
It's this
And then ultimately that identification with the domain or the field.
Yeah, it sets the stage.
Okay, so let's talk about that longer-term connection.
Okay.
How does stereotype threat affect that, the domain identification?
So domain identification is when a particular field of study or career path becomes really deeply connected to your sense of self.
Right,
It becomes central to your identity.
Right.
And it's often linked to your self-esteem.
right.
So when you identify with a field, like, you identify as a scientist or you identify as a writer,
Right.
it becomes part of who you are. Right. Now, the opposite of this is disidentification.
Okay.
And disidentification isn't just a lack of connection.
What?
It's actually an active effort to distance your self-esteem from that area. So
Interesting.
it's like you're trying to protect yourself by saying, this doesn't define me.
This is not who I am.
Exactly.
So it's almost like a way to protect yourself
It is.
from those negative judgments that
Well,
could come.
And the idea is that repeated experiences with stereotype threat over time can actually lead to this disidentification
Yeah.
as a way to, cope with those feelings of threat.
Right. So it's a protective mechanism.
Right.
And there is research that backs this up. So Woodcock and colleagues' 2012 longitudinal study of minority students in science programs actually found that how much stereotype threat those students reported experiencing actually predicted how much they later disidentified with science.
Wow.
And this disidentification then led to a weaker desire to pursue a science career.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
Right. You have the threat.
It leads to the disidentification, and then ultimately it leads to not wanting to pursue that career path.
Right.
And similarly, Osborne and Walker's 2006 survey of high school students suggested that African American students who really strongly identified with academics
Oh, interesting.
were actually more likely to drop out of high school, which was something that they didn't see for Caucasian students.
Wow. So it's almost like that strong connection made them more vulnerable
Yeah, I was thinking that too.
to the negative effects of the threat.
Like, it hurts more to disconnect when you're really connected.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's also some smaller scale studies that have found this link between stereotype threat and disidentification.
Okay.
So Osborne's work in the mid-90s, he found that positive link between self-esteem and academic success, which stayed pretty strong for Caucasian students throughout high school,
Right.
actually weakened over time for African-American students, suggesting that they were gradually disconnecting.
Oh, wow. So they were learning to kind of not let their self-esteem ride
Yeah, like they were separating those things.
on their performance.
And then there's these really neat experimental studies by Major and colleagues in 1998 that found that when stereotypes were really salient or really brought to the forefront,
Right.
African American students, their self-esteem was not affected
Oh, wow.
by feedback on an academic task, whether it was positive or negative.
It's like they had just temporarily checked out
Yeah, like they were disengaged.
that domain.
So while it might be a way to, feel safer in the moment,
Right.
it sounds like this disidentification could have some pretty negative long-term effects on whether students actually stay engaged and persist in those fields.
It's a trade-off, right? You get that immediate relief, but you might be harming yourself in the long run.
Okay, so we've seen how stereotype threat affects how you approach achievement, your sense of belonging, how interesting you find things, and how you identify with a field.
Right.
Let's move on to the last piece of the puzzle here. How does it actually influence your career motivations and intentions?
So understanding career motivations is really important when we're trying to broaden participation,
Right.
in fields where we see that certain groups are underrepresented.
Right.
And research has shown that stereotype threat can actually influence these career goals, often independently of how well someone performs.
Okay.
So you can actually be really good at something.
Right.
But that fear of the stereotype can still push you away.
So it's almost like even if you're capable, that fear can be a really powerful deterrent.
Yeah. And the general finding here is that stereotype threat is linked to a decreased desire to pursue those fields
Right.
where those stereotypes exist.
And there's a ton of research on this.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So Steele and his colleagues in 2002, and Davies and her team around the same time, they found that women were more likely to actually